honey, they're having some technical problems. They're having technical problems. So they're asking everyone to be patient.
Okay, so I believe we've just gone live on Facebook, and I'd like to welcome everyone to today's session. My name is Bill Sellers. First, I'm the president of National History Academy. We're thrilled to start off a series of visits to historic sites around the country with a tour today of Minidoka National Historic Site. And we're very honored to have Miss Joni Kimoto here with us, who's a survivor of Minidoka, as well as Kurt Ikeda, who's an education specialist for the Southern Idaho National Parks, Craters of the Moon National Monument and Preserve, Hagerman Fossil Beds National Monument, and Minidoka National Historic Site. As a second-generation Japanese American, Kurt's work is rooted in the World War II incarceration story of his grandfather, illuminated by his experience at the Japanese American Museum of Oregon, and inspired by his service as a high school English teacher through Teach for America. So, with that, we will get started, and I will turn it over to Kurt.
Thank you so much, Bill, and thank you so much for National History Academy hosting this program and having myself and Miss Joni Kimoto here together to talk a little bit about her experience at Minidoka. For those of you who are just joining us right now, the World War II incarceration of Japanese Americans was a period of history when over 120,000 people, 2/3 of them American citizens, were by executive order forcibly removed from their homes and placed in confinement sites without due process. Anti-Asian racism, combined with the tensions from the attack on Pearl Harbor, caused the loyalty of Japanese Americans to be put into question. The government claimed that the incarceration was a military necessity, but a congressional investigation during the 1980s found that it was motivated by race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. Minidoka in Southern Idaho is one of the 10 American concentration camps where Japanese Americans from the West Coast were incarcerated. So today, I join you from Minidoka National Historic Site that preserves, protects, and interprets this important part of our American history. During today's program, you may hear terminology used to describe the mass incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II that may feel unfamiliar to some viewers. Some folks may have learned about this period as the internment or as the relocation. And I just want to say that these terms are euphemistic and inaccurate, and they do not adequately describe the injustice experienced by more than 120,000 people. Therefore, we strive to use more accurate terms that do not promote misinformation, but rather allows all visitors, including every viewer today, the opportunity to learn. So, without further ado, the story of Minidoka is one best shared in place and through the lived experience. And I see on screen with me is Miss Joni Kimoto. I'll actually be introducing her right now and reading her bio off for our folks today. So Miss Joni Nakayama Kimoto Reeves is a third-generation Japanese American, a sansei. A Portland native, she was a child of the camp, a survivor of the World War II incarceration in Minidoka. As an octogenarian, great-grandmother, Joni is a docent and volunteer at the Japanese American Museum of Oregon. She has shared her stories using virtual technology and pre-COVID presentations to classrooms, from grade schools to colleges, to organizations and faith communities. She's participated in panel discussions like today and appearances in the media and interviews on her life experiences. She continues to advocate for a more humane and inclusive society, and I'm so excited to have Miss Joni here with us today. How are you doing, Joni?
I am doing great. And thank you so much, Kurt and Bill, for introducing me. It's really my privilege today to be able to soon share my story with you. I just want to say that I get a big smile, Kurt, when you refer to me as Miss Joni. You know, Kurt and I had worked together at the Japanese American Museum several years when he was education manager, and he would always respectfully introduce me with that courtesy whenever I spoke as a docent or a classroom presenter. Thank you, Kurt, for that title of respect.
You're welcome, Joni, and thank you so much for joining us today. So without further ado, let's start with place. So I'm going to have our technology folks beam us in for a virtual tour of Minidoka, followed by a Q&A with our very own Minidoka survivor, Joni Kimoto. Let's get that virtual tour on screen.
Hi, I'm Hanako Wakatsuki. Chief of Interpretation and Education at Minidoka National Historic Site.
And I'm Mia Russell, Executive Director of the Friends of Minidoka.
And we are here to give you a tour today at the Minidoka National Historic Site. We are here at the front entrance of Minidoka National Historic Site. We are right here at the guard station at the front entrance. As you look, Minidoka kind of takes this unusual shape, unlike all the other camps, which is more in a block or grid shape. But here, due to the Northside Canal right here, that's why we have this unusual shape. You'll see that we have the blocks that are kind of making up the northern blocks right up here. That is where most of the Seattle folks were incarcerated, were in these blocks. Then in the southern blocks is mostly where the Portlanders and the Oregonians were incarcerated. We also have block 44, which is down here, is where the Bainbridge Islanders were. But this gives you a good understanding of the site layout of the 900 acres of the 33,000 acres where people were incarcerated at.
Minidoka was a bit unique in that it had a reputation as being a nice camp, because whereas in places like Manzanar, people were shot for being too close to the fence, at Minidoka, the guard towers and the fence were never fully complete. There was even a report published by the War Relocation Authority that speaks to the role of the guard towers at Minidoka as an ever-present threat on the horizon, and talks about the psychological toll that they had as symbols of confinement, even if they were never fully utilized. So the guard tower behind me is a historical reconstruction that was created in 2013 and 2014. Grant. This was done as a partnership with the National Park Service and Boise State University Department of Management. The thing that's important for Friends of Minidoka is to continue to support the preservation of the Minidoka site. And you can see that when you tour Minidoka today, that many of the items on the horizon, including the guard tower, the honor roll, and the baseball field, have all been projects that the Friends of Minidoka has supported by securing the funding and managing the projects.
Over here is a waiting area where folks who did not have permission to go into the camp facility, that they would be waiting here until they could get their permission. And if you look right over here, we have a historic image of what this area looked like. I am standing here inside the waiting area remnants, and over here you see that there's basalt rocks that was stacked together to form the wall and also to form this chimney. Japanese American labor were used to help build this. And there is a story that it took a while for them to find this long piece of basalt to actually cover and make this fireplace. Still inside the waiting area, here you can see the southern boundary of the Northside Canal. You can also see we have historic reconstruction of fence line. So there was about 5 miles of fence line that was created that surrounded Minidoka National Historic Site, or the historic camp area. And unfortunately, a lot of the incarcerees were upset about this because this fence line was actually established after occupation of the site. And a lot of people were upset about how the guard towers and this fence line was created after they were actually incarcerated. And they're like, why do we need to see physical reminders of our incarceration? So they were able to petition to get most of the fence line removed, because there was also an incident where there was the Japanese American incarcerees who were working out in the field actually cut the fence so they don't have to walk around to get to work. And so the contractors who are building the fence decided to electrify a portion of it. Once that got back to the to Harry L. Stafford, who was the administrator of the camp, he decided to take most of the fence line down. There was some aspects of the fence line that remained, and that was for just safety purposes to prevent folks from going up to the canal, because at the time there were some deaths that occurred due to folks drowning. So, so some of the fence line remained, but most of it was taken out after the fact. Here's another view of both the waiting area and of the military police guard shack. You see right behind there is an honor roll, which we'll be heading towards later on. But if we focus ourselves north, you would see that we have the Robeson House. It's actually our facility shop right now. But that area where that yellow house is would have been where the military police area would have been. And imagine several acres behind that would have been where the hospital would have been. And several acres behind that area, up before you kind of get to the little hill way back in the distance, is where block 1 and 2 would have started. So there were 2 rows of blocks that went all the way from block 1 and 2 to block 19. And it started from back over there behind the Robeson, and expand all the way over there. You could barely see a house back there. That's where block 19 would have been. So we are here at the honor roll at the entrance of the camp. So this was kitty corner to where the guard station was at.
This reconstruction honor roll was dedicated in July of 2011 and was the first reconstruction project that Friends of Minidoka undertook to help preserve the Minidoka site. This reconstruction honor roll was dedicated in July of 2011 and was the first reconstruction project that Friends of Minidoka undertook to help preserve the Minidoka site. The reconstruction was designed based on historic photographs, and we know that the original honor roll was created in camp by 2 well-respected Issei artists. Kamekichi Tokita and Kenjiro Nomura were both really well-known artists in Seattle before the war, and they actually had a sign shop in Seattle that they used also as their artist studio. When they were both incarcerated at Minidoka, they both became the sign painters at Minidoka as well. So we know that many of the signs that appear in photographs at Minidoka and the honor roll were painstakingly painted by 2 well-respected artists.
And as you can see, there's 2 quotes here that's on the honor roll that I'd like to read to you, so we could just kind of think about what occurred out here. The first one is by Henry L. Stimson, Secretary of War. It is the inherent right of every faithful citizen, regardless of ancestry, to bear arms in this nation's battle. A lot of folks were a little frustrated with this during the incarceration time, because yet, they're American citizens, but yet without due process, they're incarcerated and deemed unfaithful or disloyal to the government, that they couldn't be trusted. But yet at the same time, the government was trying to draft them into fighting for this war, for this notion of freedom, yet they did not have. This next quote is by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Americanism is a matter of mind and heart. Americanism is not and never was a matter of race or ancestry. This is a very interesting quote that the artist decided to put on here, because it was Franklin Roosevelt who signed Executive Order 9066 that allowed for the mass incarceration of Japanese Americans off the West Coast.
While the honor roll reconstruction was originally created to mimic perfectly the historic photographs that were available at the time, we know now that there are many people that served in the military from Minidoka whose names were never represented on the honor roll to begin with. The Park Service now is going to create a living monument by adding names.
As we continue down the trail, we come over here to another foundation that's a little bit more intact. This was the warehouse office area. So you can see the foundation here, but the building has been removed. But so the folks who are working in here were actually administering the warehouse area, where again, if we go look east, you can see the warehouse of the automotive repair shop. That is our new visitor center. So there was a nice grouping over there of about, I believe, 17 buildings that were warehouses. We have moved farther down the trail. Just make sure if you do come out to the site that you stay on the trail to preserve the resources at the site. In the far background, over by the telephone pole, you'll see the guard tower. As we turn around here, you'll see the administration area that I was talking to you about, where the administrative offices would have been at. In the background, you kind of see that there's tree lining the North Side Canal. And as we come around, right over here, you'll see the warehouse area and our new visitor center. As we continue looking east, you'll see the baseball field, and we'll kind of turn around facing north, and you'll see the Herman House and the fire station right over here. The Herman House is currently our offices for the interpretive division, but it's also known as the Farm in a Day property. The house in front of you was built in one day as part of a farm demonstration project. In 1950, veteran John Herman was awarded this unclaimed lottery farmstead. But Herman was briefly recalled to military service during the Korean War. While away, he received a letter from the Soil Conservation District requesting that his land be used in an agricultural demonstration project to showcase the latest soil management technologies to area farmers. Herman agreed to this project, which was planned by 25 local committees and carried out by 1,500 volunteers on April 17, 1952. With much local publicity and fanfare, over 11,000 people turned out for Farm in a Day event. Volunteers plowed, leveled, and planted fields, built fences, dug a well and ditches, and moved buildings onto the site and built this house all in one day. The reason why they did the Farm in a Day project was so they could educate the new farmers, who are mostly soldiers who are coming from the front line, how to farm. And just to let you know that this program was only meant for returning white soldiers. So Japanese Americans who fought in the military were not eligible for this program until the Korean War. As you can see over by this big tree is where the Robeson was at, where I was telling you about the military police unit. So several acres behind that, and it would have been in this area, would have been where the hospital was at. And several acres behind that would have been where block 1 and 2 would have started. So now imagine from block 1 and 2 all the way over here to where there's a blue house over there. That's where block 19 was at. So you remember I showed you on the map that there are 2 rows of blocks that went all the way up there. And that was just the northern blocks. You can now see how large this facility was. So we are in the fire station here at Minidoka. This is fire station number 1 of 2 fire stations at the site. So this is 1/3 of a barrack wide by 2/3 of a barrack long. And as you can see up here in the rafters, you can see that there's a modification that extended the bay of this garage. And that was to make sure that a fire truck could fit in here. So I just wanted to point out here that you can see that the wood that was used when building up the site was green wood. It eventually shrunk as it kind of dried out, and it left gaps here. And you can kind of see that you see the tar paper that's immediately on the outside. This is what people had to live with, and that's the only thing that was protecting people or creating a shelter for them from the outside elements. Most of the folks who actually came out here was from the Washington and Oregon area, so they're more coastal folks. The Minidoka out here in Southern Idaho is a high desert, so it was really dry. So during the summertime, it got up to over 100 degrees, and during the wintertime, it got down to about -17. So this barrier for folks wasn't enough to keep people warm at times, especially during the winter time, that we actually had to bring in World War I surplus to help clothe people. Because again, when people were being forced from their homes, they didn't know how long they were going to be incarcerated. They weren't sure where they're going to be incarcerated. And when they were being moved, it was during springtime. And so now a lot of people didn't have access to their winter clothes or adequate clothing for this environment. We are now entering into the common area back here. And over to the right, you will see that there was actually a shower. And this area was the bathroom. So this is where, people were, this is one of the few buildings that people had access with indoor plumbing, unlike with the residential area. So we actually had an instance of 2 employees or 2 volunteer firefighters who chose to actually live in this space because they had access to indoor plumbing and a little bit more privacy. And as we go through the barrack, you'll see why. But over in this area, people would have we would have had some cots here where people would be loafing around until there was an incident. And then in the back 2 areas, we had 2 office space where folks worked out. Here are some images of the crews from fire station number 1. And you'll see that we also have some other historic images where you can see the water tower in the background. And right over here is actually one of our first women battalions that we had. So in 1943, there was a shortage of manpower, and it resulted in 9 women becoming firefighters. And so this 9 women joined the fire brigade, and they also worked the same types of shifts, 24 hours on, 24 hours off. And they also helped out with the wildland fires that erupted out in the Bureau of Land Management lands. So we are out behind the fire station at the footings of the water tower number 2. So this water tower and the other water tower were 88 feet high, and there was actually 4 wells that were drilled down that pulled water to help water and provide water to all the facilities out here for the incarcerees. And one thing is that these guard towers were super tall when they're taller than the guard tower there. So the water towers were actually used for like children and for incarcerees to kind of identify where they were at in camp, because most of the residential area was kind of in the depression area that's just right over this ridge, right over there. So they like all the residential areas was down in that little depression, and then they couldn't see actually the guard towers at all. Over here, you can kind of see that we have our center back over there. To the left of that, you kind of see that there is a little hump of dirt. That is actually a brick cellar. So that's the only building that we know on site that was actually created by a Japanese American. Over here, you will see we have block 22. And block 22 is our demonstration block. So you see that there's a black building right there, kind of in the middle of block 22. That was the mess hall. So and to the right of it, you see another building, which is long and skinny. That is our barracks. So imagine another 5 more barracks in front of that one barracks. So you got a total of 6 barracks on one side of that mess hall. And then imagine another 6 more on the other side of that mess hall. That would have been 1 block. So in each one of those barracks, there were actually 6 units where families could be living out of that. So within one entire block, you could have up to 72 families. So it could be between 250 people to 350 people, depending on how many people were living in these blocks. And in front of the mess hall, there would have been an H-shaped building. And that's where the latrines and the showers were, where people, they did not have indoor plumbing. If they had to go relieve themselves or go take a shower, they had to go to another building that was communal. There was no partitions between the toilets or partitions between the showers. So it was a hard transition for people to transition from having their own home, having their own private space, to living in this now communal space where there's not a lot of privacy and there's just not a lot of resources available for folks. So to the right is block 22. Over to the left would have been block 21. And behind block 21, you can kind of see that there's a road back there where there's sprinklers. That would have been block 23, where the high school and junior high school was. But now you know where block 22 and block 21 was. But remember, we were talking about block 19, which would have been one of the northern most blocks right over there. So now you can kind of see the physical distance from block 19 to block 22. So block 21 and 22, there were basically 2 rows of blocks that went out and curved around to block 44, which we would not be able to see here. We are here in center field and also in the amphitheater area. So I was talking to you earlier about how the residential area was in a depression. And you could kind of see that here, where behind me, we have the warehouse area up on this bridge. So right now, even if we're to kind of look out over to the right where the guard tower would be, we wouldn't be able to see it. So that's why when I was talking about the water tower, people would be able to see it because it was over by the fire station. But here at the baseball field, we have our backstop. We also have our benches that was made with the help of the Friends of Minidoka, and Mia is going to be talking about that. But this kind of showcases aspects of daily life that people, when they're being forced out of their homes off the West Coast, they weren't sure where they're going to go, but people tried to find a way to kind of make life as normal as possible, even though these were highly unusual situations. And one of those aspects was doing sports in camp to kind of provide that stability and that release for people to kind of do different activities. So out here at Minidoka, we had over 14 baseball fields. And we also had basketball courts, volleyball courts, and also a 9-hole golf course as well. So recreation was really important for folks, for exercise, for mental health. but it also provided that outlet as well, and that sense of community. So a lot of the teams came from, Portland and Seattle area, that they came intact. So it was really easy to, pull up the baseball teams from Portland and from Seattle so they could start playing against each other. And this was also an important pastime as well, just not only with sports, but also with Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts, was because the school, the education system wasn't even completed when people came out here for occupation, that they weren't able to actually send their children to school. So they were relying on these activities to provide that sense of normalcy.
So this is the baseball field at Minidoka, and this particular field was reconstructed in 2016 as a joint project between the Friends of Minidoka and the National Park Service. And we actually had over 200 volunteers come out from 5 different states and reconstruct this baseball field in a single day. The power poles that make up the backstop behind me were actually donated by Idaho Power, and those were placed the night before. But then our volunteers, which included folks from all over Idaho and out of state as well, and local baseball teams from Canyon Ridge High School, everyone came together and actually built the players' benches and the bleachers and a replica scoreboard, and laid the bases, chalked the lines, and weeded a lot of weeds in the outfield, all in a single day. So this was a great project that really demonstrates the partnership potential here at Minidoka. So while we reconstructed this field in its full glory with a backstop and bleachers and a scoreboard, we know that not every baseball field at Minidoka would have been developed this much during the camp years. Many of the baseball fields were placed in empty blocks that were numbered and originally intended to be used as housing blocks, but couldn't be built that way because the bedrock was too hard that they weren't able to complete the construction to make it a residential block. So that's why we know of at least 14 baseball fields that popped up at Minidoka and a lot of these empty and unused block spaces. But we know that this center field, as it was referred to, was really important for bringing together much of the camp community for events like baseball games, but also other large camp-wide events that they simply didn't have the space to hold anywhere else. Baseball was a really important aspect of life at camp. Baseball had been important within the Japanese American community going back to the days of the immigration to the United States, and was a really integral part of community life pre-war. So it only makes sense that it was also a huge part of life here in camp as well.
So we are here in the mess hall in block 22. The entrance to the mess hall would have been right over here, and you would see a secondary door right over here that has since been patched up. Back over here, there would have been 3 stoves that would have been part of the kitchen, and a table like this that people would have been served from. And you can see a historic image right over here of what the kitchen would have looked like. Now over here, you can kind of see that there's a back door. That's actually where we entered in from. But that would have been for the storage area. So the storage area for this mess hall would have been right back here. So that's where they would have unloaded all the materials to be stored. Food at the camp wasn't the best quality out here, and it kind of messed with people's systems. Most of the food that was provided was commodities, so they're like high in sodium or they're canned. Eventually, with Minidoka as being part of the War Relocation Authority, specifically part of the Bureau Reclamation Project, was that they wanted Minidoka to become self-sufficient and overproduce to actually feed all the other camps. So here at Minidoka, people started to grow a lot of the fruits and vegetables. And incarcerated actually petitioned with the administration to actually grow ethnically appropriate food, because a lot of folks were having digestive issues. And so the War Relocation Authority ended up becoming the largest purchaser of rice during the duration of the war. And here at Minidoka, we grew gobo, we had soybeans, we even had a tofu factory out here, and grew daikon and napa cabbage. So eventually the quality of food got a little bit better, but still they're rationed, because we didn't have access to sugar and other crops, because they were being rationed off for the war effort. And one of the big issues with sugar was that a byproduct of that was actually used for stabilization of munitions. So that's why it was heavily reduced for use. But here at Minidoka, you would hear stories about folks not wanting to eat mutton because a lot of mutton was actually purchased for use out here in consumption. But sometimes there was a story where the local farmer who was selling the mutton actually sold spoiled meat because he didn't think that the Japanese Americans should actually have good food, because they were under the impression that the Japanese Americans who are incarcerated here was somehow complicit with the bombing at Pearl Harbor. But one thing that we need to recognize is that that is actually not correct. Like, there was actually intelligence saying there's no need to do a mass incarceration. But a lot of people, they were just only being fed off of the war hysteria and race prejudice, that they just followed suit and they assumed, hey, we could treat people bad. So there was a time where people were sending good food, good products out here, and people were actually getting sick. So we actually had high cases of food poisoning out here that's been documented. So we are here inside of a barrack. So the barracks at Minidoka was 120 feet long by 20 feet wide. If you look right over here, this was actually the smallest unit. This was 16 feet by 20 feet, and this was usually reserved for small families. Over here in this space is the largest space. It was 24 by 20 feet. So this was reserved for large families, about like 6 to 8 people or so. Over here, you can kind of see that there's a stanchion that's separating this other unit. That would have been the two middle units are 20 by 20. So that was meant for families of 4 to 5 people. So we're only looking at 4 units of the 6 units in this barrack, because you can see that we have a wall over there. So with the construction of these barracks, they weren't spending a lot of time for the construction. Most of the time, people are spending less than 1 hour to construct these buildings, because it was quantity over quality. So as you can tell, and especially when I showed you over at the fire station, there were gaps in the wood. This building has been modified over time. Because it actually went over to a farmer who then donated back to us. So that's not in its original historic characteristic. But if you look at the walls that would have been there would have just been a panel wall. But then if you look up at the ceiling, you can see that the rafters were open. So when people first arrived to camp, they only had the walls. They were issued a cot per person, 2 army blankets. There was a potbelly stove in their unit that was coal ran to try to keep themselves warm, but there was no ceiling. So when I was talking about privacy, there was always an issue of it. If you had a crying baby in your barrack, everyone heard the crying baby. If you had an argument in the barrack, everyone heard your argument. There was no space for privacy. Some families that were living in these units, they tried to create a sense of privacy by utilizing their army blankets to kind of create a barrier or a wall for their parents so they could have that sense of it. And not having indoor plumbing, people would have to go out to the latrines to utilize that. So if it was raining or snowing outside, they had to go through the elements. So it was really hard on folks to kind of deal with this type of living arrangement if they weren't living like this. And most folks weren't in a communal lifestyle, back then.
My first pilgrimage to Minidoka was back in 2013. And when we took the site tours, I kept close company with 3 Nisei women, Nobi, Misao, and Dorothy. And Misao was incarcerated for a short time here at Minidoka because she was able to get work leave fairly quickly to become a house girl on a home in Boise on Warm Springs Avenue. But while she was here, she was in her 20s, so she has a really sharp memory. And one of the things she mentioned was that these doorknobs in the wintertime would be frozen cold and your hand would stick to them when you grabbed them. And she actually crocheted a doorknob cover for every single doorknob in her block. So there's 3 doorknobs per barrack and 12 barracks per block. And she crocheted little covers for them just to ease the discomfort of everyone around her. And I thought that was a really neat example of just a small way that everyone had to look out for each other while they were incarcerated here.
So now we're kind of up over by the root cellar, and you could kind of see block 22 where it would have been. And then now over here, you see the baseball field, and then the fire station and the visitor center. So we are here at the root cellar. So this is the only building that we know for sure that Japanese American built. So this root cellar was one of several built by incarcerees on demand, and they also built a cannery and a pickling plant. In 1943, incarcerees produced about almost 1 million pounds worth of potatoes and almost 80,000 pounds of carrots, 100,000 pounds of cabbage, all cold storage crops were stored here until needed. And in this hard desert environment, the root cellar kept crops cool in the summer and prevented freezing in the wintertime. This is actually one of the best jobs to have on site because during the summertime, it kept at a cool 60 degrees. And right now, it's not really that warm out here with the breeze, but when you go into the buildings, it's really, really hot. But this building was engineered to stay cool all year round. So the root cellar is about 200 feet long, 40 feet wide, and at capacity, it could fill about 50 train cars full of produce. You can kind of see that the middle has fallen in over the years due to just weather and other stresses on it. But the thing is, these buildings weren't meant to last. And, it's been up for about 75 years. It's in pretty good condition otherwise. But we're in the process of trying to figure out how to stabilize it, as over the years, we've had heavy snowfalls that have kind of added a lot of weight to this entrance area. As you can see, it's kind of tilting a little bit, but we're in the process to stabilize this building. Here's an exterior view of the root cellar. As you can see, it runs about 200 feet long, and you can see how that middle area is collapsing. But this area is adjacent to the main road leading up here called Hunt Road. And then right over here, you'll see the foundation of a couple of the warehouses that used to be in this area. So we are out here at the new visitor center, which was historically warehouse number 5. This was the automotive repair shop where incarcerees worked on government vehicles. You could see on the left side of this building that there's metal laths that indicates the building that this is new construction. If you look to the right, you see that there are wooden laths. That actually indicates the historic structure that we had. So after camp, a lot of the buildings were moved and some were cut in half and moved. And for some reason, this building was cut in half and the other building was moved. And the remaining building was used for the Bureau of Reclamation. And we eventually received ownership of it, and we rehabilitated this building into our new visitor center. We are here at the entrance of the visitor center. We have this quote by Dr. Frank Kitamoto. He said, "This is not just a Japanese American story, but an American story with implications for the world." We really want to make sure that people understand the importance of this story, that this isn't just a story for a specific community group, but that this story is an American story and we need to remember it so we could not oppress others in the future. Thank you for joining us for this virtual tour of Minidoka National Historic Site. For more information, please visit us online at www.nps.gov/MIIN. To learn more about the Friends of Minidoka, visit www.minidoka.org.
Fantastic. Well, I hope that everybody had a chance to enjoy the virtual tour. Quick, big thank you to Hanako Wakatsuki, our Chief of Interpretation and Education at Minidoka National Historic Site, who you saw in the video, as well as Mia Russell, the Executive Director of the Friends of Minidoka, the nonprofit group that also supports this site. I believe there are some folks who may have also heard, as well as I did, the wind during that video as well. And I hope that for a lot of us, it gives us a small understanding of what this high desert landscape was like for many of these folks who were coming from the Pacific Northwest, specifically Alaska, Washington, Oregon, and some folks from California who made up the population of the folks here at Minidoka during the World War II years. But we do greatly apologize for those folks in your ears. But with that said, I think we want to have somebody who could describe to us even better the experience, the lived experience of this time. So I'm very happy to invite back into our program, Ms. Joni Kimoto, who is here with us today. I want to ask our tech folks to help us get the PowerPoint on so we could get our Q&A started. So as was Bill said before, my name is Kurt Ikeda. I'm the education specialist from Minidoka National Historic Site, as well as the 2 other parks here in Southern Idaho, Craters of the Moon National Monument and Preserve, and Hagerman Fossil Beds. And joining me today is Joni Kimoto. Hi, Joni.
Hi, Kurt. Hello, everyone.
Fantastic. Well, in that case, let's actually move to our first question without further ado. Next slide, please. Oh. All right. Fantastic. So Ms. Joni, we have here a photo, and in 2019, so about 2 years ago, or a year and a half ago now, you had the chance to attend the Minidoka pilgrimage. For those of you who don't know, a pilgrimage is an annual event where folks, descendants, survivors, allies of the community come out to these sites of confinement for a weekend of memorial, of learning, and of commemoration. Here we have a photo of your brother Keith and yourself returning 74 years later to the site of confinement. Could you tell me a little bit about this photo and how did it feel returning back to Minidoka, Joni?
It was a very memorable time for me. And I want to kind of describe a little bit about what you're seeing here. It's two kids on to the left of the screen. That's my little brother, and that's me. And we were, I think my brother was pretty active toddler, and maybe it was my job to kind of keep track of him. And here we are on the grounds of Minidoka. And to the right, you're seeing two older siblings 74 years later. And here we are as survivors of the camp in 2019. And so, yes, we attended that pilgrimage, which was a wonderful experience. And I really wasn't sure what to expect or how I would feel when I returned to Minidoka. In anticipation of attending the pilgrimage, I recall months of planning with my family and asking so many questions to people and friends who had gone before. And I asked them, what was it like? How did you feel? And for me, this was truly a long-awaited pilgrimage. To be at, and especially it was going to be the grand opening of the visitor center. So it really was the right time to go. The trip was very well planned, and Friends of Minidoka were great hosts, and we had education sessions and stories, and I had an opportunity to meet other survivors. On the day that we toured the historical site, my family and I had rode in an air-conditioned bus, and we crossed that railroad track and we saw a canal. I think you might have seen that in that visual tour. And yes, I had that faint remembrance of that canal when we crossed. And I remembered my parents and I saw that too, 74 years ago. And I remember I had closed my eyes on that bus and I had imagined my parents and my grandparents on a bus in 1942. And it was hot and windy on that day. The ride from the railway station to Minidoka had been long and there was no air conditioning, and the bus that we sat on had, I think, hard seats. We were very tired, a very tired family, having just departed from a train that traveled probably a couple of days from Portland. And we had been incarcerated earlier for 4 months in the Portland Assembly Center, which was formerly the Pacific International Livestock Center. The blinds on that train that we rode on were drawn, and so none of us knew the destination that we were going to. We were going to a destination, to a place that we had absolutely no choice. This was the second time in less than a year that we had been forcibly removed and relocated and imprisoned. And I had thought of the despair of my parents, and they probably thought, oh gosh, why are we here? And what did we do wrong? Why did the government think that being here was for our protection? And the government had said to us, you will be held in protective custody. Perhaps the government thought that if we were hundreds of miles away from civilization, we would be protected. But from whom? And it didn't make sense. There was to be, for my family, barbed wire fences and military guards with rifles that were pointed inward. And I think my parents, my family, my grandparents, they felt abandoned and so betrayed by a nation that they were citizens of. You know, I thought a lot about my Issei grandparents. Issei is first generation of my grandfather, Inoue, and my great grandmother, Akamatsu, who immigrated to Portland. I thought of how brave they were when they came from Japan and left, extreme hardships and political changes that were happening. And they were coming to America, to Portland, for freedom and possibilities. And so for 40 years, they had struggled and they had worked so very hard managing businesses and raising a family. And they had fulfilled that American dream. And now everything was taken away from them. I think they must have felt maybe this was an American nightmare for them because they had nothing, absolutely nothing except what they could carry. When we arrived at the Minidoka Historical Site at the entrance, I remember seeing the fragments of that chimney and parts of that old stone guardhouse. And I remember looking at that honor roll memorial of the men who had served our nation, and yet their families were imprisoned in this very camp. And I remember, gosh, there were no black barracks to see anymore, or there was not any guard towers. And what I saw was mostly sagebrush desert and the wind and the vastness of that camp. The desert heat really hit us when we got off that bus, as it did 74 years ago. Only in 1942, we were greeted with a horrific dust storm. And I remember when my mom and I stepped off that bus that she had covered my face and my eyes because she wanted to protect me from that swirling dust storm. And I remember her crying. And she said to me, "Joni, this is our new home and this is where we will live." Something my mom always said to us is, "I have tears of joy." But boy, I think that moment that we got off that bus and were stepped into Minidoka, they weren't joyful tears. I think they were truly tears of sadness. And those tears became my tears when I arrived there because I had remembered my family's sorrow. And yet I felt a sense of appreciation for just being there. But something, despite that awful moment and that moment I remembered and those early years, I thought for that very brief moment that maybe it was my brother and I coming home.
Wow. My brother and I coming home. And I think the photo captures, and thank you so much, Joni, for sharing, a glimpse into the full experience of the incarceration for you, and one, right, of the over 13,000 people who were incarcerated at Minidoka, one story of the over 120,000 different stories that we have the privilege of learning from for today. If I get the next slide, please. So let's go back, right? Let's go back 75 years. This photo right here is of Block 32, which has an importance in your history. So could you please describe what Minidoka was like through the eyes of a child? And how old were you at that time?
At the time that we arrived, I was going on 4, so just a little over 3.5 years old. I am going to show you a tag first. This is a tag that was given. This isn't the same tag, it's a copy of one. But we as citizens were given this tag and assigned a family number. Mine happened to be 15259. So this tag actually accompanied me from the assembly center that I left earlier, and this became our identification number. And we are at Block 32 in this photo. And I was one of there was this barrack, the barrack that we lived in barracks, and each barrack, each block had, I don't know how many barracks to them. I think 12. Is that right, Kurt? Anyway, I was in one of the 12 barracks and I lived on block 32. On this photo, I'm family 15259. And what you're seeing is the residents of that particular block. And the building that is behind us is a grade school and a church that I think was used for different faiths. The picture is kind of fuzzy, but my father and I are circled in the front and we're sitting on the ground. My dad was the manager and he was the camp's representative. And he also became the camp's electrician by studying in the camp's library. My mother is sitting in the other circle to your right, and I don't think you can see her, but she's holding my little brother Keith, who was born in 1943, and he happened to be the very first cesarean birth in Minidoka. We had all lived in a tar paper barrack, and that had been so hastily built for us. They were thin and they were uninsulated. And we lived in our barrack. I don't know what number we lived in, but I think the room size was about 20 by 20. And in that room, we had 3 cots and a potbelly stove that was heated with coal that my parents had to haul. We didn't have our own bathroom or kitchen, as Hanako had described earlier. And we ate our meals in a dining hall, which they called a mess hall. It was maybe a mess. We used communal showers and toilets. And yes, there was a lack of privacy. It was something that we all had to get used to. And much of the time that we had was spent standing in lines and more lines and more lines for all of our needs. We had lines to eat, lines to use the latrines and for the showers and the laundry. I had been told that the camp was not ready for us. And we had no hot water to bathe. And I think cold showers were pretty prevalent. The sewage treatment plant had not been completed, and we had to use open pits. In some areas, there wasn't even electricity that had been connected. We had been told that there would be trees planted, and I think trees would have broken up the ugliness of the rows and rows of those black barracks and give us shade, but it never happened. When I went back to Minidoka, I remember seeing little trees there. I don't know if they were planted much later or maybe they were planted at the time we were there, but they were just little seedlings. Anyway, the conditions of the camp weather-wise was not good at all. And we suffered through very extreme weather. That first winter that we spent there, the temperature had dropped to 20 degrees below. So I think that potbelly stove was really our friend. And the following summer, we had sweltered in the heat of 102 degrees. Of course, there's no air conditioning and no fans, so I know we suffered greatly. But what I think and remember was rain, because the desert had turned to mud. And I remember falling a lot when it rained. There was only like 2x4 pieces of lumber that were thrown on the ground to be used as our sidewalks, but they were absolutely useless because we would slip and fall and just going to the latrines or to the mess hall. It was not easy for us to just move from one building to the next. My mom had brought in a potty for my brother and I. I didn't want to use it because I thought I was too grown up, but she said, no, Joni, I think it's a good idea for you to use it because it'll avoid going to the outdoor latrines during that rainy and winter months and having to slip and fall. I remember my mother with a broom in her hand, and she would sweep our floors several times a day. Because the barracks were so uninsulated, the desert dust would filter through the cracks of the walls. And she washed our clothes in the communal laundry with a bar of soap and a washboard. Probably none of you know what a washboard is. Our clothes were hung outside only to have that desert dust cover them again before they even dried. Yeah, we had no automatic washing machines or dryers in those days. So what does a little kid remember? I remember playing and singing. I remember to pledge allegiance to the American flag. I remember planting seeds in the Victory Garden in the back of our barrack. I thought it was a miracle for those tiny little seeds to grow into wonderful vegetables. The Victory Garden, as it was called, was part of the war effort for lack of vegetables. Everybody, the whole nation participated in this effort. But for Minidoka, it supplemented our institutional government type of food diet we had. I remember my father being such a creative man, and he learned the skills of becoming an electrician. And because of that, he made this orange crate. He made a radio for us out of an orange crate, and he painted it a bright white, and he used chicken wire to cover the big round hole, which encased the speakers and the radio tubes. Having a radio was really a no-no in camp. And so at night, we would cover our heads with the blankets that were given to us, and we'd put our ears close to the radio so that my parents could hear news of the outside world, and we could hear band music from the 40s. Yeah, Don't Fence Me In. Don't Fence Me In, sung by the Andrews Sisters, was one of my favorites. Don't you think that's kind of an irony, those words? Anyway, so many of the stories that I tell are anecdotal stories that my parents would tell me what I did as a child or what kind of a kid I really was. And this is a story that I often like to tell. It's my story. It's Joni's story. My dad had made me a red, white, and blue sign that I would hang from my neck. And I was to wear this whenever I went, whenever I left my barrack to visit my grandfather and other family members who lived on other blocks. But I was also known as a little chatterbox. And something I did was also stop to visit my parents' friends. And so when I did this, I got lots of treats from all these people. And when I got home, I could never eat my dinner. I want to show you what the sign read. Please do not feed me. Of course, this is a facsimile, but my father was pretty creative. He made me a red, white, and blue sign. So in some ways, life was pretty fun for a little child of the camp. I felt love and I felt very protected from all the pain and the shame of what my parents were suffering, but they had strength and they had resolve. Words that were used, I think that describe most of us descendants, are words that are very prevalent in the Japanese language. Gaman, gambate, shigata ganai. These were Japanese words that I heard many times growing up. Be strong, be brave, and do not complain.
Thank you so much, Joni, for sharing that. And for those of you who don't know that song, Don't Fence Me In, it truly does kind of capture not only that time, but also it means something different to these young Japanese Americans, whether they are 3, 4, 5, and 6, or in their teens or in their 20s, dancing the night away in these Saturday night barrack dances. And Joni, thank you so much for sharing a little tidbit of what Block 32, what life was like in Block 32. I have about 3 more questions for you, and the next 2, hopefully, we could get through a little bit quicker on the last thing, because I do want to get this last question about family and legacy. But for right now, on screen, we have a very important artifact. Oh, on screen, we had a very important artifact. And as we try to get it back up again, it was an indefinite leave card. It's a specific card that folks were given on their way out of camp. And as we try to get the PowerPoint back up, would you mind just kind of telling me a little bit about what life was like for you after camp had ended, for your family experience? Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, we went to Chicago, and there's that card. It's the indefinite leave card. And this card was actually gave us permission to travel, to leave Minidoka. And I am photographed, and on the back side of the card is my fingerprint. Even my little brother, Keith, had an exit card. I think the government still considered us enemies. And in 1944, we were still at war with Japan, and the government wanted to keep track of its citizens. My father went ahead and he worked as a washing machine repairman for a very, very kind Jewish man in Chicago. My mother, brother, and Keith, my brother Keith and I had followed, and we lived in the south side of Chicago. I entered my first grade there, and it was really exciting for me to be with kids who didn't look like me. And because I did not look like them, and because I was of Japanese ancestry, I was their enemy. And this is the first time I had heard hateful words: Jap, slant eyes, Tojo. Tojo happened to be the military war general in Japan, and he was like a Hitler or a Mussolini. So they were hateful words. And I had never heard these before. I didn't know what that meant. And I was bullied, and I was chased from school, and I was even bitten. And I figured I was their enemy. And I was a victim of racism and hatefulness. And I really wanted to go back to Minidoka. I felt safe there because even though they had barbed wires, I was not treated that way. And so when I was 8, my parents had sent me to live with relatives living in the West Coast at the beach, a small community called Netards. And I went to a school close by. It was a dairy community, and it was a very slow, idyllic place for me to grow up. But the children that I experienced, again, a different type of prejudice. The children there were of Scandinavian and European descent, and they really had never seen anyone that looked like me. So now I became the other kid. And that very first day of school, the principal had put me on the stage, and he had introduced me as a little Jap girl. And that was a very embarrassing, and I felt ashamed to be Japanese. My classmates were curious, and they had questions and touched my black hair. At that time, I had lots of black hair. And they asked me, "Did you come from Japan?" And I said, "No, I am an American." Did I drink milk? What did I eat? Oh gosh, they were just silly questions. But that was 1946, when there wasn't TV or cell phones, internet. The world was small and they didn't know. And the war had ended, and we finally resettled into Portland. And, all those years, my parents were so silent about the injustices and the incarceration. And they never talked about their constitutional rights. Their reference to Minidoka was just camp. It was just camp and camp stories. And when I was about 19, I finally discovered the injustices that had been done to us because of a college professor's assignment. And he asked me about my family's experiences of incarceration, and I didn't know. And he said, you know, you need to know. So I, for the very first time, had reason to sit down and interview my parents and to hear their thoughts and memories. But it was painful for them, and they just didn't like talking about their time in camp. The silence that they had was broken, and I remember writing a paper, and it was the first time that I had even spoken about this. I was only very young, but I was asked to speak at a Baptist church in North Portland because that was the beginning of the civil rights movement.
Thank you so much, Joni, for sharing so much of what happens after camp. And for those
Yeah.
of you who are joining us today, I really implore everybody here to think of that moment when they felt otherized, when they were seen potentially in the same way that Miss Joni, you were seen. One word or phrase that really stood out to me from what you just said right now was how when you were a child in Chicago, it almost felt safer to be back in your site of confinement, in your incarceration camp. And I almost wish I could go back and tell that young girl that she would become this incredible speaker, friend of the community, survivor, justice fighter, a lot of different words to describe you, Miss Joni. So I just want to thank you so much for sharing a lot in that short space amount of time. The last two questions, and if you get to the next slide for me, please. The next two questions really is about legacy. This photo is a very incredible photo. It's a very celebratory photo. I'm going to give you the chance to actually describe it. This is from 2019. But would you mind telling the audience and me what compelled you to tell your story?
Yeah, we were invited to the ribbon cutting ceremony, and there's my brother, and I had a cousin with me there. This was right in front of the Visitors Information Center, the new center, and it was pretty exciting. Can I just show you something that was given to me? It's a memento.
Please.
Yes, this is a memento of what the center was before. It was warehouse number 5, formerly the auto repair shop, and it was dismantled. And so they gave to the survivors a piece of the wood. It's interesting because there's a nail that sticks up, and a Japanese meaning means if a nail sticks up, you need to hammer it down. I think what it really means is don't be conspicuous, don't be different, because if you are, there may be some resistance. So maybe I don't know, maybe there's a symbolic meaning to this piece that I got. It's something to think about. Anyway, that pilgrimage really enlightened me, and I felt the importance of continuing to tell my story and educating others. As seen in the film, there's a place where Hanako talks about what's over the visitors center, and they're words. They're very powerful words, and it reads, "This is not just a Japanese American story, but an American story with implications for the world." These are words from Frank Kitamoto, and those words resonated with me. History teaches. We have to learn from our past mistakes and do not let it repeat. We must remember the past because certain things have happened in the last maybe 15 years of my life, and they were like the Muslim vetting, and more recently the separation of children at the border, and the increase of anti-Semitism and the brutalities and continuation of systemic racism, and now the renewal of hatred towards the Asian Americans. And, you know, those acts of blaming others and labeling and targeting with violence and hatred only makes me feel the importance of solidarity and helping to speak out whenever I could. You know, I have lived and experienced similar struggles, and all of those, what I have experienced has given me a better understanding of racism and oppression of people of color. You know, if we have the loss of rights and equal justice, all of that, those have shaped my life as it is today. And so, as a survivor, I have felt that it is my responsibility to, again, to tell my story.
Thank you so much for taking this afternoon to truly share your story with us today. I know that we have a few audience questions, and I'm just going to try to handle a few right now. I'll have a chance before we get to our last slide, which will be coming up in a second. Some folks have been asking a little bit about what happens in terms of the great history that spans this whole experience, right? It'd be silly for us to think that 1942 to 45 encapsulates the whole Japanese American experience. It truly does not. Whether we're talking about pre-Pearl Harbor with anti-Asian sentiments growing from the 1800s onward to even 1988 with the Civil Liberties Act passing, which did lead to, as some folks have been asking in the comment boxes, about reparations as well as redress. Yes, this story, as Joni was alluding to in her time in the 60s, going through college and trying to hear these oral histories of her own family, this story is still very much an ongoing one and connects to the greater American story. Joni, I truly appreciate the terms you said, right, about solidarity, about standing up. This phrase about the nail sticking up, I think it is truly on the nose, right? It is this notion that you break that mold and you do stick up, because if we don't stick up, if we don't speak up, then we're complicit in that violence, in the violence against folks of color and other marginalized communities based upon identity, just based upon who they are. I've so enjoyed this conversation with you, and I'm so sad we're getting to our last question for our planned Q&A. And I think nothing is more appropriate than finishing this Q&A session than with this wonderful picture of your family. It's pretty self-explanatory, but Joni, could you please tell us, how did it feel to have your family with you in 2019 at the Minidoka pilgrimage?
It was a bittersweet, emotional, fun, and connecting. And I was so thankful that we as a family could share that time together. And there were 14 of us in this photo. My husband, my brother, sister, and my fourth generation daughter and a fifth generation granddaughter standing right next to me. I also had my cousin and her son and a nephew and nieces, and even my great little 6-year-old niece who's standing next to my brother. So we had 3 generations connecting to truly a common bond of great grandparents, great grandparents, and who sacrificed so much, having their freedoms denied and living under such harsh, deplorable conditions of this kind of prison camp. And all because we were thought of being as the enemy because of racial propaganda, wartime hysteria, and I think Kurt mentioned before, a failed political system. This all resulted in that Executive Order 9066. Now, this photo is not only in front of a rescued barrack, but we're standing also on sacred land that belonged to the Shoshone Bannock people. And I had heard that there's one possible meaning for Minidoka, which I thought was really interesting. Minidoka is a Native American Dakota Sioux word, and it's been interpreted as meaning fountain or spring of water. So isn't that interesting that here we are on this high desert and it's described as bringing forth. So for me, being on this pilgrimage was, I think, a place of hope. And it's to remind us that that kind of tragedy in our history should never happen again. And I want to thank you for inviting me to speak about my story. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Joni, and truly powerful words, how this should never happen again. I'm actually going to bring us one more time back to that PowerPoint, because I think there's one more last slide for folks who are interested in learning more. We have some fantastic questions that have been coming through today, and I do want to finish up this last piece on this. Thank you so much, this resources page. For those of you who are interested in learning more, or coming out for a visit like Joni and her family did, please check out the websites you see here, including Friends of Minidoka, Mia Russell, who you saw in the video, as well as the Minidoka Pilgrimage Planning Committee, which organized, or was a portion of organizing, that trip that Joni's family took in 2019. Thank you so much. If we get one last slide, please. And as you all are joining us today and learning more about your national parks and your public lands, and thank you so much, we could just get back to the video, to the screen now. I just want to really take this last second to thank the National History Academy for the time to bring Miss Joni and I together to be able to discuss just a little bit of the lived experience, these places that we interpret and that we have the opportunity of talking about and protecting here, specifically, of course, here in Southern Idaho for myself, is only a place, but it's the stories of folks like Joni Kimoto and many other survivors who've taken the time to not only speak, but to teach the next generation, the next generation, and the next generation. This is the way that we ensure these stories are never forgotten. So Ms. Joni, as we are wrapping up here, I want to just kind of give you the floor for any last comments that you might want to say. I guess my direct question to you is, if there was a young person who's watching today, and I think I saw about 100 people were joined today at least, and many more will watch because this is recorded, what do you want to say to that young student who might be starting to learn a little bit about the incarceration experience? What do you want them to know?
I think it's very important to look at other children and to be accepting of them and to be kind and understanding and learn their stories. I think learning today is probably the most important key to our future and to the future of these young people who will become citizens of our world. And history is very important, and understanding others is more equally important. I know there have been some questions here that, would you like me to address them?
You know, I think for the time being, we're going to try to shorten the experience, but let me actually choose one that I think maybe if we could try to tackle that in maybe a 2-minute span. This one really stands out to me from Michael O'Brien. Joni, how do you and your family manage to avoid becoming embittered by the treatment and the experience? You are all very loving and generous people. I have an answer for this as well, but Joni, I'm gonna let you tackle this first. How do you respond to that? How did you avoid becoming embittered? Or maybe that question isn't fully encapsulating the convoluted feelings around this experience.
I think those feelings are, first of all, they were, there's that Japanese word again. I think that really speaks for my family and me, more so my parents. That word is gambate. It's a very strong word, and it's part of the persona of the Japanese. Yes, we could be very bitter and we could be very vindictive, but I don't believe any of the Japanese Americans or the Issei's felt that ever or were that way. Gambate means to be strong, to keep going, despite all the oppression, despite all the pain and suffering you've gone through. That's only going to drag you down, and just going forward is the key. And I think that's what my parents did, and that's what they taught me growing up. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing, and to address Michael's question as well. You know, we are sharing one story of 120,000 different lives, and you can multiply that by multiple descendants. I think to create a notion that no one is bitter, right, or to create this myth that everything is washed on over is truly not the case. In fact, Joni, the fact that you're here with us today, fighting for the causes that you are fighting for, on the moral authority of being a child in a concentration camp, I think is just one way of looking at this piece of history, not as one that we could look back on and say, wow, that was a mistake, and let it be at that. but to look back on it and say, we know we could do better. We must do better by people. So I think the question is well-founded. But I truly ask us to consider, is it really about moving on from something, or is it really about learning from something and doing something about it in the future? So I really appreciate you sharing that question, Michael. We're wrapping up pretty soon today. So what I'm going to do now as we wrap on up is actually bring Bill Sellers of National History Academy back onto the screen so that we could finish off, because we're not just one experience, we're one of a series. So Bill, what else do we have to look forward to?
Well, thank you so much, Kurt and Miss Joni. This was wonderful and so very timely. And as I said at the beginning, this is the first of a series of virtual tours that we're going to take of important historic sites around the country at a time when we really can't travel. Many of us around the country, it's a blessing for us to be able to hear from you and to learn from you and to get those incredible life lessons that you shared with us today. But over the next few weeks, we'll be at next week, same day, we'll be at Gettysburg National Military Park, in 2 weeks at the National Museum of Industrial History. Coming up down the road are the Oklahoma City National Memorial, the Sixth Floor Museum, many others. We plan on doing at least one a week, and we might expand on that. I also might just say we're opening up our enrollment for National History Academy for our high school and middle school students this summer. Coming up next week, we ran residential programs in 2018 and 2019. We went online last summer, and we're going to offer online programs again this summer with some incredible experiences for young people to learn about the foundations of our democracy and what it means to be an American. And to kick off our series today and to think about what it means to be an American through Miss Joni's experience is incredibly meaningful, and it's something that our young people need to hear this. So thank you very much, and it's been really an honor for us to host you today, and we look forward to staying in touch.
Fantastic. Thank you, Bill. And thank you so much, Miss Joni. I just want to say in front of 100 people here, I love you dearly. You are family to me. And thank you so much for sharing your story today.
Okay. Thank you.